So hello everyone, welcome to our second presentation for today, which is on citizen jury, the true community participation and planning. So before we start the presentations, like always, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather or meet today, and acknowledge the Warami people as the traditional owners of the land of Port Stephens, on which sits our site of North Arm Cove. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and extend the same respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be listening to this session. So for today, we have got amazing Iain Walker, who is the Executive Director of the newDemocracy Foundation in Australia, a role he has held since 2011. Iain has led over 20 trial projects at the local government and state government level, including projects with state premiers on both sides of the politics. The topics have ranged from long-term budgeting for $4 billion City of Melbourne financial plan to the potential for a high-level nuclear waste storage facility in South Australia in the water industry. And now that we are discussing about North Arm Cove, we have Iain to discuss about the potential in the North Arm Cove, and I would like to put Iain on the spotlight, drive the conversation and let us know how community participation is so important in the decision-making process.
We've been working for 10 years on a problem of how do we innovate in democracy. Have you ever noticed everybody complains about how we do democracy, but you never see anything change? That's essentially what we're trying to do. So we don't take issue positions. We're not on any side of politics. We simply look at process in the system. We've run basically the largest democratic experiments that have been run. And for context, people like the UN Democracy Fund and the OECD now ask us for advice on this topic. So we're not just the next 5 people that got rounded up on the street. We've been working on a very specific problem. And the way I like to start things is how I would answer the question that I put to you. Democracy is when we act on the informed general will of the people. Okay, that's all we're really looking to do. If most people look at a decision and say, I've read a bit about that and that looks fair enough, then it's a democratic decision. It means I don't think ever in terms of right answers. The Liberal Party thinks there's a right way to fund the health system. The Labor Party thinks there's a right way to fund a health system. So do the Greens, so do One Nation. I don't think there's a right way. I think there's a way that the vast amount of the population looks at it, and not out of a wish list, but having weighed up the relative costs, they settle on a decision. And so that's all we're really looking at, the informed general will of the people. Now, why do we do this? I'm not going to harp on this, but generally people are dissatisfied and politicians are aware they're dissatisfied. So that creates an opportunity for us to go in and actually start to say, let us run a real world project, maybe in a planning situation, but we work in all sorts of areas, that moves beyond the public opinion dilemma. So politicians really respond to public opinion. And I hate public opinion polls. Public opinion is what we ask people when we ask people what they think when they haven't had time to think. This is a terrible idea. And then politicians take that very, very seriously. Now I want to draw an analogy, and I won't keep picking on you, Umid, so I'll pick on Polita. Polita and I have a night out tonight, a terrible night, very late, we get arrested by police. What will we not do? We won't demand a phone poll of 1,000 people to determine if we go to jail, because those people won't know anything. They won't have the facts, they won't have heard different stories. They'll just go, I think he should go to jail, and click a button. Instead, we would probably convene a criminal jury where a very small sample of people get to hear from multiple sources. They get to see it firsthand and decide who they trust, and they start to conceive of much more depth in the topic. And that's the difference between public opinion and public judgment, time and information. So, jumping ahead. Oh, I'm one activity ahead. So, right, I've got to the right place. I want you to think of an activity. You've probably all tried to order takeaway food or a pizza with a group of friends. Think about how you did it. You probably didn't call for a vote. Because what happens if there's 6 or 8 people, and in this case, Polita's vegetarian. So if we get 5 votes out of 8 for meat lovers, do we order the meat lovers pizza? So that is the limitations of voting. There's 5 of me, there's 3 of you, you can all get lost. We're having the meat lovers with extra salami. And 3 people get really disappointed. Now, you all look like nice folks, so you probably discussed things and found a middle point. And instead of having the pizza that you absolutely love the best, but avoiding the pizza you detest the most, you managed to discuss things with your friends and actually find middle ground. That's an informed common ground position, and that's what's different from a vote. And I know it's a kind of a simple example, but what I want to show is, as groups, we're capable of reaching agreement. We reach agreement lots of times in our lives, but then we have to make a public decision, and it comes down to simple numbers and putting up your hand. I want to put to you that voting is what's wrong with democracy. Now, it's kind of a weird idea, but if you followed me through, what if elections are what's stuffing up democracy? Because they emphasize public opinion so much, I make you a promise that I impede your willingness to talk and listen to others. So in the time we have, I'm going to step through 5 principles behind what I think makes a democratic decision. And as you think about a future of democracy, as you think about the society you want to live in, think about how much you might want to include each of those principles. But first, I want to start with a little thought experiment. And in any group of 10 people, there's someone who's going to hate it. But it's kind of a fun exercise in realizing that even things where you think people are really polarized, it's actually quite possible to find a little bit of common ground. So we'll jump ahead to that. Can everyone see the screen okay? I'm getting enough nods. So I only want you to look at question 1 for now. I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes. Now, the reason I'm picking climate change is it's one of those wonderful topics in politics where people just go boom and lock in at either end. And people always say to us, how could you possibly find informed common ground in this area? So this could backfire, but let's have a go. I want you to take just 1 or 2 minutes and think of a percentage, 0 to 100. What is the likelihood of a catastrophic event occurring in your lifetime as a result of climate change? I want you to think of a number, and you can either, if you've got a pen near you, just write a number and hold it up to the camera when you're done. But the point is, I just want to see a number from everyone if you're happy to do that. I'll give you a minute and stop talking. And Joanne, if you haven't got camera capability, just flick it on the chat would be an option if you want to play along at home. Okay, I've got Umid at 90%. Everyone hold up a number if you're ready to go. Got Polita at 80. I've got another 80 for Joanne. Krishna, I can't see. Krishna needs a thicker pen. Are our moderators playing too? Okay. 30%, Krishna, thank you. 100 from Noah. So Noah's not going to be the person who doesn't love this exercise the most, Noah, so play along here. So the point of this exercise, people often say to me is, we tend to get, and you're a group who's done way better than the average, because you know what most groups do? Most groups answer 0 and 100. That is a real tendency that people rush, particularly political groups, rush to the extremes. How can you cannot find common ground between people who have 100% certainty and, well, 0% is effectively 100% certainty of something not happen. But for everyone between 1 and 99, it's a question of degree. What do we say to the 0 and the 100% people? The climate is very, very complex, and having 100% certainty about anything is really tough. So if you would think and say, well, I'm happy to be 99% certain, then it becomes a question of degree. So think about if you had to make a democratic decision around this. One of the exercises we say to the 1% people, because we've moved the zeros up to 1%, what's the likelihood of your home burning down? Now, the likelihood of your house burning down is about 1/200th of 1%. And yet people pay for insurance. They pay about $1,500 a year for insurance. For the 99% people, we say, so how much of your income would you be willing to spend on things to address climate change? And we get answers like, oh, definitely $5,000 a year. And you start to see we've turned an immensely polarizing issue into the difference between $1,500 and $5,000 a year. You start to see how people can work to find common ground when they move beyond a simple vote behind something and start to move into a question of degree and start to look at their reasoning. Now, I want to move on to the second activity that hopefully you can see on the screen there. I want you to think, because it's a topic that most people have thought about at some point, and being just 5 of us, you don't need to hold things up to the screen, but I will just call on 2 or 3 people. And it's this, you can see the question on screen. What, if any, action do you most support in the area of climate and energy policy, and why? Just be willing to give a sentence or 2. I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about that one because it's a slightly trickier question. Give me a thumbs up when you're done and ready to talk, and oh, Krishna, right off the bat.
Should I say?
I just wait for the others to have a little bit of time, and we'll. I can feel your keenness, though. I'll come to you first. I've got Noah. When I've got one more, I think we'll move on. Okay, let's maybe, we'll give the other guys will have the time to polish, but let's go to Krishna first and then Noah. What's your action, Krishna, and what's the why? Why are you saying that to me?
The action is solar farms. And why? Because it doesn't take away jobs from coal or mining industry, but it just adds up more jobs, so it's not taking away, but also giving a healthier option.
Great, good answer. Noah?
Can you hear me? Is everything okay? Awesome. I think, well, looking at what we already have in terms of the construction industry, we have building standards. Why not sustainability standards? How much, for example, green energy can a building produce? How much energy should conserve? That sort of stuff. So I think we should have sustainability standards, just as we have construction standards.
And why are you saying that? Simply because you think it'll make a large impact, or?
Well, I think, like everything, if one house, for example, is super green and eco-efficient, it doesn't do that much on a global scale. But if we have a standard, the government standard, then every single house has to adhere to that, and I think that'll make a real impact.
Thank you. Did Sophia or Joanne, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I can. Probably it's the ones that are kind of mostly involved in the daily lives of people, for example, solar panels, because everything starts with the mentality of people. You can have these super expensive programs, but what's the purpose if ordinary people don't see the reason of them? So yeah, kind of that point.
Right. I'll open it up to Joanne and Umid if you want to offer one, or if you're feeling shy, you don't have to.
No, that's okay. So mine would be more funding and investment in renewable energy, particularly focused on solar and wind. And the reason being, when I think about climate change, it's kind of a cause and effect scenario. And the cause would be energy, and the effect that we're seeing is climate change. So my thing is target the cause, and that will immediately have positive benefits on the effect. So starting off with energy, switching over to renewable would be the first step.
Okay, thank you. So you've done that task exceedingly well, and you're breaking the activity for me wonderfully. Because what most people actually say in this is, because I just feel that way. All four of you actually offered a logical reason that flowed from what you are asking and into a logical reason. And generally what we have to do in a public opinion sense is that you actually took enough time there and we gave you a prompt so that you thought about reasoning. But in the absence of that, raw public opinion, it's easy to dismiss it. Now, the third part of this activity is the hardest. And I want to be, we're not asking you to go away and post a link to a given report. I want you to start thinking now about someone who doesn't share your view, someone who holds a really different view to you. And you say what you've just said on this call, whether it's Krishna about solar farms, Noah on standards, Sophia on the importance of local actions, Joanne on the investment environment for solar and wind. And someone across me said, I'm not buying that. What evidence would you offer so that they share your view? Now, don't think in terms of anything specific, just think in terms of types of sources. Well, I might want to hear from an energy company. I might want to hear from an investor group. I might want to hear from a specific type of scientist. I might want to hear from multiple different sources who disagree with one another. I just want to give you 2 minutes to think about the type of source that you might ask for. So that if you had a meeting and we talk about public decisions and you had to hand the recommendations that you just offered to me and we had to hand them to a Minister for Energy and Climate Change and they said, well, what are you basing that on? How would you support that statement? So don't get lost in this. Don't try to get too technical about it. Just think of the types of people. Maybe they're economists. Maybe they're people who work in the solar industry. Maybe they're academics at universities. Just give thought to a couple of sources that you might draw in or types of reports. You might look at what's the fact underpinning it. Sophia, when you talked about local actions, maybe it's the kind of emphasis where in another policy problem like waste and recycling, it has been local actions that transformed it. So maybe you'd start to look at what are parallels where problems have been solved like that.
Yeah.
I know you've got the hardest one to do. That's why I tried to offer you a little bit of a fish there.
Yeah, I wanted to say that looking just at real life examples, because we already have a lot of cities where these problems are, people were living and facing these problems, for example, especially in overpopulated cities like in India or other countries. And there are problems that are actually already people are trying to solve. So yeah, the real life gives the best examples.
As a group, if you could just take maybe 2 or 3 minutes though, because it's what I'm trying to do is shift you beyond anecdote and just push you towards where might evidence exist. So what type of people might you ask? I might just give you 2 or 3 minutes for that. And again, just give me the thumbs up when you've had enough of the activity. It's okay to find this hard, guys. I'm crushing into 15 minutes what we do in 25 hours with a group of citizens. So we're skipping a few steps. I've got Joanne.
So I take a two-pronged approach to this, with starting off with the either government agencies or international agencies such as IRENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency. Get some data from there that showcases, because I think the biggest problem is when people think about renewable energy, they think of reduced jobs in the current existing sector. So showcasing through data that there are more jobs in the renewable sector will kind of possibly sway opinion. And the second approach would be through data collected from non-banking financial corporations, NBFCs, that currently invest in green initiatives. And I think that would be a good source of information to showcase how profits can be made through renewable energy while still being good for the environment.
Joanne, you've nailed the exercise. Absolutely perfect. You've come up with primary sources and you've got specific questions to look for in data points. You can sleep for the rest of this presentation. You've nailed this. I think Krishna had his hand up next.
So there are some examples where some countries which are mostly have arid conditions, such as Dubai or one state in India which already has solar farms and they have been successful. I can use that case study as a case study or an example maybe.
Great. So you go to a corporate source. Here's a project that generates 5 megawatts. It employs 100 people.
And Australia having a desert in the center, right? It's a good way to persuade them and tell them the potential in over
Krishna,
here.
your evidence would convince me. You've gone and said jobs matter, and you would be showing me a jobs environment. Again, primary source and real world evidence. It's practical and real. I think, Noah, did you want to come in? Mute.
You're muted, but
Sorry, I was muted. One of the things that I would consider first before actually trying to educate someone on agreeing with me is finding out why they disagree in the first place, right? And then from that, you can kind of build a better feedback and know how to educate them. And then you can go into stuff like what Joanne and Christian have said. They've both nailed it in the head with their topics.
Fair enough. No sources to add. We don't have to hear from everyone, but Umid, did you want to jump in on this, or you haven't enjoyed this half the activity quite as much?
No, that's not the thing. I was just wondering, I just had a question pretty for Krishna and Joanne, the question that I wanted to ask, because they were talking about job opportunities, but the question was, I'm just taking the role of a villain over here, but so is it the same type of opportunities that they're talking about? So if you close down the coal industry, so the people that you're actually taking out from that place might be a bit let's consider them they won't have the same education to take part in building up solar farms. So what about those people? You're talking about.
I just need to constrain what could be a fabulous 52-hour Zoom. I'm just going to keep it constrained to the 45 minutes.
Yeah,
I love how you're engaging on the topic, but you risk driving us wildly into one of those wonderful climate conversations. What I was just trying to show to you is, if you picture what I want to do with citizens, I want to give them a question like, how should we respond to climate change in terms of energy policy? And what I just encourage you to do, I'm going to give them about 60 hours spread across 4 to 5 months. So I would ask them to make an informed decision. What questions do you need asked, and who do you trust to inform you? And we encourage people to consider multiple competing sources on the same topic, because you should hear from different points of view. You know, it comes up in the news every so often, does the ABC have a bias? Every media outlet has a bias. and all of us have biases. And the pitfall is to think that one source is true and everyone else is wrong. Well, everyone has a reason that they are selective in terms of the data, etc., that they put there. But the purpose of this activity was to take a topic that everyone feels they know a lot about and push beyond the simple just for 15 minutes. And hopefully that gives you a sense of, wow, if I got a chance to do that for 50 or 60 hours, I could ask and get answered so many questions. And to Noah's point, yes, I did skip something, Noah, but it was in the interest of time. Yeah, we very much get people to say, I think this, why is it that you do that? And it's very much getting people with a mix of views together in one place. Because the biggest problem that we have in our democracy is we don't mix with people all that different to ourselves. And that's one of the things we want to challenge. So hopefully that little activity is warmed up for the next piece, which is, you know, this is the one slide takeaway from what we think of principles of deliberation. And deliberation simply mean a decision that's not rushed off the top of your mind. Classically, it means a group of people who have equal share of voice and equal access to information, not just the noisiest person always getting to speak, which obviously favours me. Now, 5 things I want you to care about a lot. Democratic lottery is random selection. Information, time, authority, and that we ask people a genuine question, okay? You might think these are the 5 most obvious things you're ever going to hear about. And then you realise anytime you engage with government, they do none of them. So why do they matter? Random selection ensures that we don't just get the most interested people involved in a discussion for any democratic process. It can be urban planning, climate, budgeting, anything. Government can announce that they're going to engage on a topic, and there's a bell curve of views in the community. Who talks to them? The 2 people at either end. And they say this, government, you absolutely have to do this. And the people at the other end say, don't do that or the world will end. And when we hand those 2 views to government. Now, unsurprisingly, this doesn't work. I want you to think to my criminal jury analogy that I used at the start of the call. Can you imagine if we did criminal juries by self-selection? You would get 6 members of the defendant's family turning up. You would get 6 members of the victim's family turning up. Do you think they would agree? No, people with the most at stake can never find agreement. And that's where the criminal jury is interesting, because as a society, look at the importance of decisions they make. They make decisions that result in people getting locked up for the rest of their life. And we trust it. You know, you see criminal jury decisions pop up in the newspaper, in the news from time to time, and you don't tend to think, oh, I wonder who they got a donation from. Or I wonder who they're trying to help out and what they're trying to do with their career and manage their media profile. No, we trust them because it's people like us selected for a job and then taken back to the community. And that's what we mean by now a democratic lottery. We think public decisions should be made. Your starting point, how do I get a representative group of people of the community together? I'm going to pick them at random, 30, 40, 50 people. Think about the definitions of democracy we used at the start of the call. You don't get to have a vote, but if people like you and you had an equal chance of being drawn, would you consider that democratic? Now, what do you do with the people who have an absolute passionate view and need to be heard? Well, to use the courtroom analogy, they're more like expert witnesses than they are like jurors. So everyone who has an impassioned view can be heard by a jury of their peers. Picture that climate and energy topic, whether you're South 32 mining coal or whether you're Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace, why not give them all a chance to make their case to a group of people who will then be allowed to do that same questioning and sourcing exercise you did a little earlier. We think this makes for a democratic decision. Now, we do this because I'll do a little bit more on this democratic lottery because it'll save 10 questions later. It's not purely random. It's called a stratified random selection. In essence, it's when you do a random draw and say, make sure my random draw is 50-50 male and female. Make sure my random draw has people broadly representative to the census by age and income. So we just use 3 or 4 variables and just do a simple random draw and end up with a pool of 30, 40, 50 people. And if any of you are thinking 50 people, that's nowhere near enough to make a democratic decision. There's only 76 people in the Senate. So large numbers are not always a good thing. Now, the second key principle we care about after we've got our representative sample of people together, well, an opinion poll's a representative sample. I don't like that. Now, the next step is, how do we ensure people are grounded in information? Now, don't ever try to be a font of truth. What we're looking for really is to consider multiple competing sources. So traditionally, you would let government say, this is how we think things are. We would let active and special interests, people like industry groups or advocacy groups, etc., we'd let them answer the question. And so all of a sudden, as a citizen, you're sitting on 20 potential documents. But critically, and the part that I mentioned at the beginning, we'd also say to people, to make an informed decision that you can stand behind, what do you need to know and who do you trust to inform you? You start to see how we can bring together a lot of information. Now, one of the things people ask me, often say to me is, well, why will anyone read all this information? Nobody reads anything today. You're all too young to be taxpayers, but let me assure you, when you are, you still won't read boring things about the tax department. And that's because of a phenomenon called rational ignorance. When you're one of 16.5 million voters, your rational choice is to go do something outside, go have a night out, see your friends. But if I've made you one of 50 people and you get the chance to meet with a premier or a treasurer, you notice I've given you tremendous incentives to read and learn. And that's why we look at that influence and authority point at the bottom, because that influence and the small group of numbers combine to get people to consume information. Now, you guys were clearly too educated to help me out with this, because normally I get some absolutely terrible answers during the question and support your argument session, where people go, oh yeah, I could have thought of that differently. And the critical variable in this is time. Now, as you make decisions, as you grow up and maybe get a first car, or maybe think of a first overseas trip, which is going to be a lot of money for an airfare, a vaccine, and planning your itinerary, you'll make a slow decision. And a slow decision is a good thing to make. Time is what helps group come together and realize that people with very different lives to theirs are still okay people. So people like our methodology and how we do this, it's all in person in the room. And attempts to do it via Zoom like we're doing today actually don't work very well. There's something about actually sitting in front of people that is really, really powerful. So if you start to look at this, what do I see as a democratic decision? I see a random group of people. I see them given abundant access to information, assisted by us, because we will go and find the sources that they ask. We did a renewable energy inquiry and asked people, again, the same exercise you went through, and the question came up on solar panels. And the critical question for the group was this. They said, we don't need to understand the science of solar panels. We understand big hot thing in the sky. We get that, makes electricity, no problem. We want to understand why the projects fail, which went to, I think, Joanne's point on investment. Why didn't they work out as investments? When we said to them, what source would you like? And they had 45 minutes where you had 2. They said, well, we hear a major project just failed in New South Wales. So we'd like to hear from the chief executive of the renewable energy company funding the project. And we'd like to hear from the most senior person you can get from AGL who didn't buy 30 years of supply that would have made the project viable. You see, they got 2 sources on the same question. We got them the chief executive of Pacific Hydro. We got them the chief economist from AGL. And in a Zoom session like this, you got 45 minutes to talk to that expertise. What I'm hoping to illustrate is the group is very capable of coming up with a list of questions. With that information, they can make a better decision. But to do this, to let them figure out their own sources, to give us time to find those sources to come and talk to them, takes time. But if the decision is large enough, that time is worth investing. Now, tying it together is this idea of influence and authority. We all act on motivations. We all want to be heard. Most people don't contribute to democratic decisions today, aside from voting, because if you don't vote, you get fined. But in terms of governments asking for input, you'll be maybe unsurprised to know very, very few people do it. And the reason is government's mostly already made up its mind. And that's why the last principle there is absolutely critical. Government has a tendency to issue a draft finding on what they want to do. So they'll stand up with a draft report and say, here's our proposal. Would you like to comment on it? Now, we think that's a terrible idea. Instead, you should share the problem. You don't put up a plan for how your town is going to be planned and say, comment, because when the final plan comes out, I guarantee you it will look just like the draft. But if you can pose an open question and say, how do we want our place to be? What's the right mix of residents and sporting facilities for our area? And let people solve it themselves. Then we think this is at the core of a democratic decision and solves the hardest problem in our democracy. It's that people will trust it. We are rightly cynical of many decisions. So I'm going to give an example, and I should have asked your ages before doing this, but this might be a little before your time, but please work with me. In about 2015, the Abbott government commissioned a thing called the Commission of Audit. Now, the Commission of Audit was essentially how you save money out of the budget, and it explicitly was looking at the health system. And after about a year and a half of work, which cost them millions of dollars, and I really need Tatiana and Diane, I realised, to weigh in on this to help me out, but they came out with a proposal that to go to the doctor would cost $7. It was called the GP tax, and it blew up in the press, and it died about a day later. Why? Because we didn't trust a particular side of government for some people. They had specially appointed someone that we didn't trust, so we looked at it cynically. Tatiana, I'm really hoping you remember this part of Australian history, that you don't think I'm just lying to your students and making things up. But so that was a really nice example. And what I'd invite you to think about is this. Imagine if the Treasurer, the Prime Minister, the Health Minister had asked a sample of 100 Australians one question and said, how can we pay for the health system we want? Now, remember I said at the beginning, there's no right answers? There's no right answer to that question. But if it was a genuinely representative group of people who were in all sorts of jobs, you know, blue collar, white collar, unemployed, they were a mix of ages, they were a mix of backgrounds, and they're from all over the country. If they could find agreement, wouldn't you be interested to know what they could agree on? If that mixed group had heard from 40 or 50 sources and spoke about what they learned or mistrusted or challenged with each of those sources, you'd start to see that it has some substance. If those people put 6 months into it, you'd know that it wasn't just something they had been, tricked up over someone just getting something tricky past them. You'd know they thought deeply about it. The fact that it had influence and authority is why you'd be hearing from them, because the government would have transparently agreed to respond. And you'd know it wasn't just a little bit of tricky work either by a government department or a lobbyist or the interests that they represent, because they started with a blank sheet of paper. They actually wrote their own response and stood behind it and said, we wrote this, it's not a draft written by government. So as you think of what does the future look like, I want you to think that that's the future for our democracy. It can be complementary. It can be something where our existing House of Representatives and Senate add and pass to a whole of the people and say, on very difficult issues, we need to know the informed general will of the people. So hopefully that is an interesting snapshot of what democracy can be tomorrow. Why do this? It's the last line you're looking at. A great decision is not one you agree with. A great decision is one which earns wide public trust. And we think that public trust is going to come from the use of randomly selected people and giving them a real opportunity. So with that, that's too much from me. I'm happy to open it up to questions that you've got. Unless I've stumped you. Umid, jump in.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, I really like the opinion of, having like something like, having like a group of people actually giving opinions and actually deciding on something. So, actually coming to a sort of at least a middle point, on conversations. But today, like how we actually run the government or how the government actually gets elected is like through them giving their opinions on what they're going to do. And that's how like people vote for them and just like, just gain office. But so in the future, do you think it's actually possible that people would like whoever wants to get nominated would just be like, you know what, we're here to listen to you and your problems, and so vote for us. Do you think that's actually going to work?
I mean, when I started this job 9 years ago, the person who funds it said to me, I want to get rid of all of them. I don't like politicians. I want to get rid of all of them. And I said, that might be tricky. So we're going to start with, and we're going to move up. In practice, do you know who hates what we do? It's people in the Senate. Okay? They're very detached. It's a pretty obscure voting method. Do you know the politicians who talk to us the most? It's not about left or right. It's people who've done 2 or more terms, because they've realized that there's a whole bunch of things they don't have the power to do because public opinion washes over the top. And that turns out to be a barrier. I want to give an example, but it might be timely for, can we just pause the recording and I might just give a slightly more vivid example? Real good example. Other questions? I'll give shorter answers, will be helpful. Stunned into silence.
Can I ask you, Ian, maybe we were talking about maybe the example where this residence jury is being implemented in local government in within, for example, Sydney metropolitan area. I know that City of Sydney is keen maybe on people, let's say, voting on their mobile phone for any planning proposal or any new projects or something. What do you think about that?
That is a terrible idea. It's public opinion. People who don't know anything, it's self-selected. I want you to look at my 5 principles on the side of the screen. So it won't be a random group. It'll just be those who hate something the most or those who have the most to gain. It'll be done based on no information other than a couple of lines. So there'll be no time. They'll ignore it if they don't care. So I don't know about the specifics of the project, but any click to vote stuff tends to be rough. We did an interesting exercise with Geelong Council got fired by the Victorian Parliament for about 100 reasons. Now, local government Victoria had contacted us and they said, we're thinking of doing a digital plebiscite to everyone in Geelong, about 240,000 people, and saying, in essence, do you want to still have single member wards? And they did some market research and it came back that 80% of people want single member wards. We said, that's good. Did you ask them what a single member ward is? No. So what I'm trying to drive with this is, if you ask people for a recommendation on something, it requires some technical knowledge. If you ask them for their values behind the decision, we can actually just answer that. That's a really good use of a survey or polling format. So we modified it and sent for 2,500 people. We asked them a values-based question. When it comes to trusting a local councillor, what are the traits that are most important to you? Someone who has a job like me, someone who has a background like me, someone about my age. We offered them 10 questions, 10 responses. Interestingly, a write-in response, like a free, you do other and get to write in your own answer, ended up coming in second. And that was someone I find honest. Not the point of why I'm bringing up this example now. What came absolutely last was someone who lives near me. Now, someone who lives near me is the basis for having the entire single member ward system. So you see that you get this complete difference between asking a values question and asking a technical question. In the absence of information, people just kind of want to keep to that what they have today. So it can provide real misdirection. What is it? I'll put it this way. Tatiana, would you like to go to heaven?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll come around this afternoon and kill you. So you start to see there's a link between going to heaven and needing to die. Okay, and that's where I got you on asking the output that you wanted. And it gave me the license to say, well, what I heard from voters is they want to die. Thank you for playing along. I didn't feel I could do that to one of the younger students without causing nightmares. But there you go, Krishna's into it. But that's an example of what we're trying to do with formats, that values are good, but people can rush to judgment. Thank you for smiling through your death, Tatiana. I appreciate it. Any other questions? Because I drastically need to change the topic. If we've brought it to a natural, oh, sorry, was that one Noah?
Where would a good starting point, like an initial getting the ball rolling on some of these issues and how we kind of start incorporating that sort of thing?
Sure. I'm going to give you a series of answers to that question. One is you can start at school. I'm not sure every school's different, but student elections, I think, have pretty much disappeared. Does anyone actually have student elections and class presidents and stuff like that? That's great. That means you're living in an autocracy. You are the North Korea of education. So there'll be some decisions in your school where you may want to have a say. So starting point one, and Polita, who you see there, will shortly have a fact sheet on how to do this, is you might end up saying at your school or your university as you progress there, I want to be able to make democratic decisions at school. Why don't we randomly sample 20 students and see if they can find agreement on certain things that are, you know, decisions that are in play. I'm not going to show my age by suggesting examples, but you get the sense of you could create a democratic structure within a school that is not simply, you know, the captain of the football team and the smartest kid going head to head in a popularity contest. You can actually get a representative mix of people together. Students, as you head to university, the elections there are the absolute end of the world for being awful. So University of Sydney has 54,000 students, about 1,800 vote in the election. And all those people, if you look at past student presidents of universities, they end up as the politicians you see in Canberra. Gee, we'd love to see a little bit of disruption in that area. So as you move into university, you might think of applying that same model for student government there. To go to what I think is the core of your question, we work on show, don't tell. We run demonstration projects so people see them and can decide if they trust them in real life. And as we run larger and larger projects, we hope to run a major federal government project. And that's, you earn the right to do that by running 30 small projects quite well and owning up when you get it wrong. So how we think the system will change is by showing it, because people are going to see it and like it. And if they like it, politicians like to do stuff that voters end up liking. There's a much longer and more complex answer to that, but hopefully that gives you a sense of how we think we can get this implemented. More directly, in Victoria, the Local Government Act now requires this method to be used for setting council budgets, council plan, council strategy. It requires the model we've just described, and they're about to introduce that in Western Australia. I'll come back to Umid.
Yeah, just wondering, how does the show don't tell work exactly? Because, show don't tell. Yeah.
Means you run projects. So
when you're running for office, like, would you actually you need to have actual power before you actually, like, if you want to show some work.
I know. No, we go and meet with politicians, and I ask them one question: tell me what's hard. Tell me the hardest problem that you're facing. And unfortunately, guys, I can't reveal the advocacy that we do now because it's confidential, but I can talk about a past project. So when Jay Weatherall took office in South Australia, I got 6 texts that afternoon that said, this guy likes your stuff. So we chased a meeting. It's politics. It still takes 3 months to get a meeting. And I said, tell me what's hard. And he said, it was around alcohol-fueled violence. He said, right now, what's hard is in any given summer in Adelaide, 3 boys under 20 will die from a one-punch assault on the streets over summer. It happens every single year. And he said, my problem is this. If I increase regulation, I am the nanny state, I am the fun police, we get smashed in the press for 3 weeks, my backbench loses nerve, and we do nothing. Conversely, I look at it and say, this is just about policing. We don't need to rush to extra regulation. And the papers will run on, I'm asleep at the wheel. I'm not protecting our kids. I've got my priorities wrong. And then he said, you know what's worse? Is I could take the 20 greatest minds on this topic, put them on a desert island, and come back with the perfect policy and say, here, this is what I'm going to introduce to Parliament. And 95% of people will think the Australian Hotels Association wrote it because we take donations from them. The other side takes donations from them. we cannot make a trusted decision on this topic. That we ran a project on how can we have a safe and vibrant Adelaide nightlife. We recruited 43 people at random. They had 6 meetings over 4 months. The authority was Jay agreed that their report was immediately public on completing. So they finished at 4:30 on a Saturday afternoon. We had it live on the web 3 minutes later. So no chance for political manipulation. They responded in writing in 45 days. He sat with them for an hour 2 months later to go through the bits the government would and wouldn't implement, and where they wouldn't. He gave reasons behind it. And he tabled the report in Parliament, so it was in full on the public record. We think that added to a democratic decision. What was interesting is we actually did the same project in New South Wales, but there was an aversion to doing any press around it. And it serves as a really good case study that any MP who was around at the time of those one-punch laws, we've got what the jury produced, we've got what the government did, and consistently MPs say, yeah, I wish we'd done this version. Citizens solved the problem better than our parliaments did. So I keep giving long answers to short questions, but that's how show don't tell works. We show the projects through the most visible opportunity we can get, which also serves to show politicians how capable citizens are and the value of finding common ground. I'm preaching.
I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Sure, Joanne.
So the thing is, you spoke about how when you're having a democratic discussion, it's best to involve people that are knowledgeable on the topic so that they actually have valid contribution that can lead to some sort of development. What happens when the discussion and the effects of the discussion are going to most impact those that are less educated? For example, let me just give you an example. Rural electrification in India. While mass villagers, the population living in villages are gonna experience the effects of that, they are gonna think of short-term gains as opposed to the long-term entire viable process. But then how do you not involve them in a discussion that's gonna either benefit them the most or hamper them the most, depending on what the situation is?
So, great question. So I've got a 2-part answer for you. One is random selection. We really do get all walks of life. So early on, the first 2 or 3 projects, we just sat there and we could tell we were getting too many university educated people. We knew we had a skew. This is why we're a research foundation. You test things until you get them right. We started asking people if they own or rent where they live. Turns out it's a very good indicator for income and education. If you straight up ask people what income band they're in or education, everyone's a doctor and everyone's a millionaire because they hate the question. So you need to look for some surrogate indicators, some revealed variables. But as a general rule, our parliaments are very unrepresentative of the poor. So while random selection isn't perfect, it's much better at getting that real diversity of job, of level of wealth, of everything else. To a specific example, we got asked for a briefing related to public housing. And I think it's a good example because if you accept public housing is overwhelmingly a service for a poorer segment of society. So hopefully this example works. So remember I talked about stratification for that democratic lottery? We always ask, who is the community? So in the public housing example, we said, we want people to see someone like them involved in the decision. What does that look like on public housing? It's 1/3 people who live in public housing today. It's 1/3 people who are on a waiting list or on a waiting list and missed out. And it's 1/3 the wider community who are involved by virtue of taxation, etc. So what I'm going for is descriptive representation, not a statistical representation. In essence, I'm not trying to pick people in proportion to how they are in society. I'm trying to pick visible numbers of people so that everyone sees someone like them involved in the decision. So for rural electrification, and forgive me, I don't know enough to adapt the example, but you clearly need to say, well, I have a pool of people directly affected by the decision that have to be involved, and a pool of people who may be missing out, etc. to your actual point about how do you get people to not just rush to, I benefit and forget all the costs, time. In any given project, if I pick 40 people, we will have 1 or 2 people convinced they can solve everything by morning tea on the first day. Okay? We say to them, wow, that's fantastic. Saves me flying to Adelaide 6 times. What is it that you'd share with everyone so that they share your view? And then they go, I like the papers, it's in the papers, and you start to see, so how about you take the time to see how you could substantiate that by giving people the chance to ask questions. That rush to judgment, it's a shared learning experience. Time is what moves people off sugar hit decisions that don't add up. I always like the example, Joanne, I live in the Blue Mountains in Sydney. Gee, I wish there was a bullet train. So that's my wish list response to things. Do I accept that it will cost me $100,000 in tax to get that bullet train? Now I'm having to weigh a trade-off. It's the wish list to trade-off. So that your answer had your question had a couple of layers in it. We're pretty confident we can recruit so that there's a mix of, rich, poor, differently educated, different ages. We can use stratification to tilt that if it's going to be an issue that really affects one group a lot. And if that group's in there and you're concerned about their education layer, we've run enough project examples in quite poor locations in northeastern Brazil. We're running a project now in Malawi where, it's a very basic society there, quite very low income country. It's $300 a year is average income. People are interested in the world around them. And when you give them the opportunity and the structure, they're capable of asking great questions. So the roundup answer is you build a process that gives them the opportunity that they wouldn't just naturally do themselves. You're just giving them opportunity. Gosh, I'm giving long answers tonight. I'm killing your timing. Do we want to do a couple more questions, or have we exhausted everybody?
It's a great session. Thank you very much. And case Paulita has had to leave, so I just wanted to. I wanted to mention. I mean, just a comment. It's not a question. The two things. One would ask, what does this have to do with architects? So for me, one is, your founder is an architect.
Yeah.
So Luca is an architect, so he has started this and came up with this process. The second one is, and that shows how old I am, is I still remember the movie that I watched when I was a kid, and it was even that time it was old movie. It's a 12 Angry Men, and it is about jury and about decision making in a basically situation where just one person has objected to the unanimous decision to send a guy to death row, and that one person had to manage to convince 11 others, and with the proof, with all the with the evidence that person is actually not guilty, and that hero was also an architect. So that kind of gives me whole idea of what architects can actually do. And
down my first week in this job, I trotted around to the great and the good, and one of them was a former premier, Nick Greiner, and we said, I've got 2 bits of advice for you. Just say jury, people understand the jury, and start with the planning system. It's the least trusted, most crooked part of all of government that no part of society trusts. Where the jury can make the greatest transformation is in how our places should be. And that's why a trial, as your group takes on different interests, hopefully I didn't need to join the dots directly, but the opportunity to determine how a place should be has got to be less about the noisiest voices and arguably property developers at either end, and more about entire communities working out what's fair and what they can live with together.
So basically your opinion is that your methodology and your principles can be applied to our particular problem in North Arm Cove.
Absolutely. Is planning topics. We did a project for the ACT government on all of ACT rezoning, and it was transformative for them. So we can see this is a very well suited topic because there's so much information and trade-off to understand. If you want a nice park, working out what the park costs and therefore what development levies you might live with somewhere else in order to pay for that. It's a wonderful example of the trade-off instead of just a wish list of saying, build everything for me and don't worry about the cost. And that's where we can really get governments to respond. So if you find a community and a council that really wants to do this, I think you'll find the Department of Planning is getting increasingly curious about what a demonstration project could look like.
Any more questions, guys? I think.
Thank you and good night.
I think we'll have to, you know, it was really a wonderful presentation, and I'm glad that participants get engaged, and I hope they enjoyed it as well. Thank you, Iain, and we'll conclude here.
Pleasure, and thanks for, that was a fabulous group in terms of interaction, guys. So I really appreciate that you all came up with answers and jumped in. Polita will be kicking off a movement on this at some point. So if you follow New Democracy Oz on Facebook or something, you'll start to see something get announced in January if you're starting to get a little bit of a taste to hear more. So good to meet you all, and thanks for playing along.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.